Seymour Orner was stationed in the South Pacific during World War II. The story goes that he wrote a letter to his wife, Lorraine, every single day. She didn't write back that often. Seymour responded to the prolonged periods of silence in one letter he sent to her where he wrote, "Another day and still no word from you." 70 years later, author Peter Orner has those letters. They were sent by his grandfather, Seymour, and the all too few ones from his grandmother, Lorraine. Seymour pleads with Lorraine to send him a letter, to send some word from back home for him to read. Writes Peter Orner, "Maybe we read because we seek that word from someone, from anyone. A lot of us read because we seek words from Peter Orner." This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Listeners of Book Public know Peter Orner as the co-host of the Book Public series, The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner. I spoke to him about his new book, Still No Word from You. Tell me about the title of this book.
The title comes from a letter that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother during World War II. My grandfather was a captain of a LST, which is a weird small ship called a landing ship tank. It basically landed tanks on beaches and stuff. And anyway, my grandfather was a lawyer and insurance executive, and during the war, he volunteered. He was too old to be drafted or anything. He volunteered. He was like 39, 40, and ended up going to the Coast Guard. And he was so good at that. He was just a very good sailor. The Navy took him, and they eventually made him a captain of a ship. Anyway, that's not what your question is, but he was in the war, and he was in the South Pacific. And I've had for many years all of his letters that he wrote to my grandmother, and pretty literally, there's a letter a day for the time that he was gone, which was about almost 2 years, if not a little more. So literally a letter a day, and I've been reading these letters for years, and I even used them in a novel once. But the issue seemed to be that she wasn't writing him back, that he would write her, and my grandmother would not write him back. And this went on and on. I mean, every letter is like, "How come you don't write me? Tell me what's going on, what's happening at home." And I think my grandmother's just having too good a time without him. They didn't maybe have the best marriage, and she didn't have a lot of time on her hands. Even though she was not fighting a war, she had 2 kids to raise, and that's probably even busier than he was. So anyway, in one of the letters, he says, "It's been such and such length of time, and still no word from you." And I that struck me as being sad and kind of poignant, and also pointed to my grandmother having a life, which I thought was really interesting. So that's a very long-winded answer.
No,
that's where the title comes from. And I guess how it relates to the book is that, this idea of like, we're all sort of kind of waiting for word from somebody, aren't we?
Yeah, that says it. I mean, it's enigmatic, but that really says a lot to contextualize even some of the other things I'm thinking about that happen in this book. So the selections here are in categories, but I see these sections: morning, mid-morning, noon, 3 p.m., dusk, and night. So I want to ask you about these sections. How did you hit on this method of organization for what, like 107 chapters?
I mean, we all go through this problem of how to structure things, especially I tend to write in pieces, and so I'm always trying to figure out how they go together. And in this case, a couple of books that I was thinking a lot about and that appear in the collection or the book or whatever you want to call it, memoir, are books that take place in one day. Very famously, Ulysses, Joyce, a book that I teach, and revere and think is hilarious every time I read it. And every time I read it, I usually don't finish it, I should say. But it's hilarious, and it's also, just kind of the ultimate example of like what occurs in one day is infinite. And another book that I also talk about in this book, a wonderful book by Bernadette Mayer, who's a really great living poet, maybe one of our best living poets. I believe she's in her 90s now, and she wrote a book called Midwinter Day, and it takes place on a single day in 1977, I believe. And in that book, she literally covers from morning to night her life with her family, her husband, and her kids. And it's, she's making dinner and writing.
Mhm.
She's having sex and writing. She's taking out the garbage and writing. It's just like everything in that one day. And like Joyce, it's again, it sort of hits home that idea of like, if you really think about one day, it can be, as monotonous and monumental as one day can be. So that was a part of this book. And the other, I think the reason that I ultimately decided to structure the book around a day was that I had a book on my shelf for years by a woman named Ida Vigis, and that book is called Light, and it's about Monet's garden at Giverny, I think is how you pronounce it, and it takes place in one day as well. And in the opening of that book, it starts beautifully where Monet is sort of chasing the moment just before dawn, not when the light has actually happened, but just before dawn. I was really struck by this way of thinking about a single book being a single day.
Well, and you say something similar. So, Light is a work that you talk about much later on. It's the 18th piece in the book. And the Bernadette Mayer is 79th, if we're keeping score.
Right.
But all the way back at the very beginning of the book where you talk about James Salter's Dusk, you do allude to this idea of being, quote, drawn to the moments before a story becomes a story. So it's like being drawn to the moment before the light, right? It's just such a very interesting kind of pattern that I'm hearing from you. But I do want to say this before I lose it, that about Bernadette Mayer and Midwinter Day, you say in the book, I'm going to proclaim, ordain, howl to the void that this book constitutes the greatest celebration of family life ever written by an American. And then you have this line that says, unpaid bills and laundry, if you think they can be separated from love, you don't live in the world. So that really stuck with me. And I have to tell you, I did not know about Bernadette Mayer. I hate to always admit my ignorance to you about readers, but this is another beautiful thing about your work, this book and Am I Alone Here, and so many things that you write, is that you bring to your readers more to read. So we get to read your stories, your words, and your words about these books, and then we go chasing after, Eva Figes and everybody else. So
Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate that. I also, I worry sometimes that, like, when you talk to book people, I was like, have you read that? Have you read that? Have you read that? And it gets, I hate to be one of those people. You know what I mean? And the fact of the matter is that no one's read everything, number one. And number two, there's so many books that have been, kind of you miss for whatever reason. And I love those kind of conversations. And I absolutely, many of the books that I write about are books that somebody else told me, hey, you ever read this book by Bernadette Mayer, where she just writes from one day from beginning to end.
mm-hmm.
And I should say about that book, she says, and I think I believe her, that she literally wrote it across that one day. And that was the book. And it's just an amazing kind of thing to contemplate, especially if you read it, because it isn't just a recording of what she's doing and thinking about, but it roams as far as the imagination can roam. So she's all over the place because she's all over the place in a single day. She's not completely present in her own life much of the time. And that's part of the beauty of the book.
Well, you write about a lot of women in this book, and we've named a few. And I'm thinking also about your mother, though. This book is a lot about your mother, and even in a way about your mother's reading life, not just your reading life, but your mom's in a way, and your mother's notes in the margin. Can you share a little bit about that story about the little note that you found in a book that your mom had read that your mom wrote?
Sure. It's funny. I'm in Chicago for Rosh Hashanah, and I'm in my mom's office. She's 85 and running for re-election of the North Shore Water Reclamation District trustee. Many listeners are in her district. Please vote for her in November, the Democrat in that race. But I'm looking at her books here, and she's got Little Women, and then Crime and Punishment, Heart of Darkness, Look Homeward Angel, Emma. So for some reason, Anne Rand is stuck in there. I'll have to talk to her about that. Thackeray, Flowering Judas, Catherine Ann Porter. Anyway, my mom's a big reader, and the story, the essay you're talking about is has to do with my leafing through her copy of Lawrence Ferlinghetti's Coney Island of the Mind, and seeing some notes that she wrote at, I believe, around the time that book came out in the late 50s, 59, 58. And she makes a little note in the margin of a poem. And it kind of led me to imagine my mom arriving from, fairly smallish town in Massachusetts, into, marrying my dad and moving to Chicago, and sort of just being blown away by the city and life in the city. And I was imagining her, very young, married to my father, also very young. And I just was trying to imagine what it was like to be reading this sort of, kind of beboppy, jazzy collection of poems, and, kind of just being very excited about living. And so that kind of led to my trying to imagine what she was thinking when she made that note.
That's such a lovely story. I just love that story. Being able to see her something that she's written in the margins of that book.
Yes.
So this book is something like your previous book of essays, Am I Alone Here? In that it's very much about other works of literature, and it's also very much about your reading life and your family. But this one, I don't know what it is. It feels different. It manages something different. I was trying to figure out what that was about. We're all different, I guess, or today.
Yeah.
So
Age.
I think what I mean to say is we approach our reading differently at different, and you and I have talked about this a lot, at different stages in our lives.
Right. Right.
And the same is true of our writing, but I can't put my finger on it. It's something else. It seems to me like you're coming at the work with the same unapologetic, unabashed. I'm thinking, I wrote down this other line where you say, I have a friend who said, I practice a form of nostalgia that borders on hysterics. And I take that like as a very positive thing, and how we try to avoid hyperbole when we're talking about works of literature. But
Right.
there's still all of that here, but I'm perceiving, I don't know what, I can't put my finger on it. I can't characterize it in any way, but there's something, maybe it has to do with the passage of time, or there's something there. But I do love reading about Mrs. Engerman, and a lot of the hearkening back to childhood from this
Well,
vantage point. I think it's so special. So there's a lot of that interplay of time. And I know that that when you approach your reading and your writing life, it's not like it's so calculated, you know. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm chasing after here. I have a page of notes about this. I want to ask Peter why this is so different.
well, I always appreciated that, and you're the kind of reader I'm trying to talk to, and I wish I could answer it. I mean, I don't know. I think it has to do. I mean, I didn't want to write the same book. I promised myself after um, the last book of essays that I wasn't ever going to do anything close to a memoir again, and I turn around and I do it again, and so I was very conscious of, you know, why do this if it's the same book again? And I think the difference is that this one, I hope, has more unity. The pieces were sort of written to literally speak to each other, not accidentally speak to each other like the
Mm-hmm.
last time around. I think I was being, I'm not very deliberate in method at all, but I think that the same consciousness, um, I was more, I was literally trying to kind of create some unity of conversation with myself, if that makes any sense.
It does. It does make sense. I thought I had a clue when I got to this chapter 73 in my notes in the 3 p.m. section. So it's where you write about Chekhov, who needs no extra context, as you and I both know. But you do say, "Hail Chekhov for letting the most minor of enigmas stand without comment." And you're at the Dunkin' Donuts in Grantham, New Hampshire on February 12th, 2020. And that's right around the time we're all learning about this strange flu, this virus, and people are popping out of donut shops wearing masks. And there are free samples of a sausage sandwich of some kind.
Right.
And then
The new Dunkin' breakfast sandwich,
yes. And
which
then
is sort of like the old Dunkin' breakfast sandwich.
that's what you said. And so then suddenly you start to talk about Myra, and you say, no one loved her, and her life was passing by miserably without affection, without the sympathy of friends, and without any interesting acquaintances. What a terrible thing it would be if she fell in love with her position. And then you say, imagine the calamities if our stray daydreams came true. So I kept sort of like, okay, if he talks about Chekhov, there's a clue there about this whole book. And that's what I came up with, but no. The search
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that's pretty good. I think it does have a lot to do with something. It's a cliche. Like be careful what you wish for, kind of thing. And I think that's a cliche that stands very true. I think, and I think Chekhov's story in the cart addresses that like no one ever has. It's a woman who is it's a school teacher and like you said, unappreciated and sort of miserable in her life, but also proud of herself too. She has a great deal of authority. She has respect, even though she does not have love at all. But she considers this drunken landowner that is single and sort of imagines what would be like to be with him for a few minutes and thinks that's actually could be a wonderful thing. And then Chekhov just slams the door in it because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because she doesn't want it to happen ultimately. And I think us daydreamers, always need a reality check. in the sense that the daydream may be the thing, the life that we're living, which is wonderful too, you know? And I think maybe that you're right. I think that does have to do with what this book might be about, in the sense of, like, again, it very comes very, very close to cliche, but the miraculousness of a day, and if we just pause to think about it, which I rarely do, and so when I write about it, at least I'm desperately trying to do that. And I was, kind of clinging to this idea of, the wonders of the daily life that we generally think is not so exciting.
Well, I don't know. That reminds me a little bit of something that you said about the idea of repetition in your books. At a certain point in the book, I'm recalling where you say something like, in the context of a story about your father, that the stories are repeated and they don't get lost. And you say something like they get repeated into oblivion or something. But
Right.
the idea of repetition is so important. And, so the idea of cliche as like, oh, this repeated thing. But I think it's very important because, I mean, and I'm so stating the obvious. If you encounter it in Chekhov, on a day when you need to encounter it in Chekhov, like, that's a good thing. That's a very positive thing. But I'm also thinking about, we learned so much in this book too. I mean, I certainly did, about, besides authors that I'm not super familiar with, but then also some of the tragic stories of some of these authors. And so, I mean, I've heard about Maeve Brennan, of course, but I was not that familiar with her story. And then so the other miraculous thing that emerges from this book is, I mean, part of the time as I'm reading about these authors and some of the terrible things that happen to them, is that's what makes the fact that their writing exists even more miraculous to me.
Right.
It's like, how
Right.
in the world?
Yeah. Mae Brennan had it pretty rough, with alcohol problems and um, mental health issues for sure. And so it is kind of remarkable, but it isn't remarkable that anybody is able to, like, get it down for a little posterity,
Yeah.
And Brennan's just a great example of what survived, what was really pretty much a wreckage of her life was ended in fairly, um, pretty roughly, let's say.
Mhm. This idea about, um, sort of covering um, the smallness and the bigness of life in a story that transpires in one day. When I got to the chapter about Rita Dove's work, this sentence, "The notion of our being intact in stillness is ultimately an illusion." I mean, that's about bearing witness, but it's also, I mean, I take it also to mean like, yeah, you feel like you're standing, like you're standing still in one day, like nothing's happening, but there's a lot happening in one day. So I like those kinds of connections that I encounter sort of on my own as a reader, just kind of going through um, and making these small discoveries that maybe I need to make at a certain point. But that in particular stayed with me. This book is underlined and highlighted and multiple colors, and then I have a notebook full of notes. So this is all these gems that I wanted to like post on social media and give you credit, of course. But I mean, there's these literary tattoos, these kinds of things. They're all over this book. But I wanted to ask you the noon section. I went through and there. So you talk about, let's see, Joel Hoffman, Beth Howland, James Joyce, James Allen McPherson, Terrence Hay, all in one section. So anybody that I just mentioned there, can you choose one lightning round and tell me what you think? Just first thing that comes to your mind in the context of this book.
Well, I think the Rita Dove pieces in Noon,
Mm-hmm.
and, uh, and that one should just open to. I'll just read the first line. I'll be doing something, anything, the dishes, and I'll look out the window at the road, the carless, quiet road, and I'll see myself falling from where? Nowhere, just falling, or worse, infinitely worse, my daughter or my son falling, falling. And I'll be reminded again of Rita Dove's Zeppelin rising, and the three men, the one who jumps off early and lands safely, the one who hangs on, and the other one, the third man, who, as the airship Akron rises higher, higher, loses his grip and lets go. And it's a scene in a poem where a man is standing that night, I believe, um, Thomas of Thomas and Beulah fame of Rita Dove's book of that title, a married couple named Thomas and Beulah, and Thomas has witnessed this blimp disaster, and like I described, one man lands safely, um, another hangs on and rises with the blimp. I guess I was just thinking a lot about when that guy falls, the one who rises with the blimp, when he falls, that where she describes him clawing the air. That when you claw the air, there's like nothing. When you claw something, you need something to claw, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Dove like realizes that action is so futile, right? I mean, he can't. The air isn't giving him any grip, right? And it just struck me as just being like it's an image that has haunted me, like I described, and I just, to me, that happens throughout the day. You know what I mean? Where I just have horrible imaginings. I mean, I don't think this is a dark book because like there's a lot of survival in it, but that guy doesn't survive, and the poem is as much about the guy who doesn't survive as the one who watches. And is the guy who watches a survivor? Yeah, he gets through the day, but it's not without a lot of tough stuff having had to endure. And I think at the end of that piece, in this piece, I talk about it is safe to be the watcher, but how safe? How safe? Because he's got to carry that image around. Why that happened in the middle of the day of my day in this book, I'm not sure, but it's just like there's constant warnings, and there's something about the vividness of that poem that struck me as being appropriate for the glare of noontime, I guess.
Mm-hmm. You know what? When I read that the first time, I flipped all the way back over to the very first piece in the book, and I knew right where it was. It was the second page of that piece where you're describing your mother, and you say, I know I read something in her eyes as if she'd already taken off. My mother, the sound of her splashing, scrubbing, and then stillness. I don't know. There is this very interesting conversation within the book. The idea of stillness, and it's not the same idea as still, no word from you, and we're not going to diagram sentences here and talk about parts of speech, but there's this idea that recurring for me that was so beautiful. But I want to ask you too, there's poetry here. Tell us about poetry. Tell us about what you think about poetry. I love poetry myself. I say this all the time. It's my first love. And I don't write it because I'm a terrible poet. But I love to read it. And I love to read about it. But you approach poetry the way that you approach stories and novels, and you almost don't even have to tell us what the genre is, and we're in there, moving through the action or the emotion or whatever it is. But what is it that makes you pull the book of poetry off the shelf?
Here's where I get a little like aggressive in the sense of like isn't it a shame how removed most people are from poetry as opposed to maybe more in the past or even If you think about other cultures where poetry is very much a part of everyday experience. I can recall somebody once telling me that when the Mexican poet Octavio Paz passed away, and maybe this is apocryphal, but people were weeping in the streets, you know. And Paz is not an easy poet, right? And so it's not as if we're talking about, like a simplistic, kind of, somebody whose work was somehow accessible, right? Um, I think everybody read Paz, even though he was difficult. And it seems to me that we're cut off, you know, from that for whatever reason, whether it's academia or whether it's this idea that certain literature is only for certain people. I don't know. It just bugs me. And so, I'm not a literary critic at all, and I don't know much about poetry. That's just the honest truth. But like you, I read a lot, and I don't necessarily know technically. Even though I I sort of can read it really slowly and carefully, but that doesn't mean I know what a villanelle is. You know what I mean? And so, and barely, some of the other ones, which, sonnet. I mean, I sort of know what a sonnet is, but nonetheless, I couldn't get through the day. I couldn't get through my life, and not to mention any kind of writing life without reading poetry. And the basic thing is because as a fiction writer, I have to pay attention to sentences and language and rhythm, and I can every day learn so much about that by reading a great poet. So yeah, for me, it's just like an essential thing. It's not like it's like I love to read poetry. It isn't. It's just like just a part of the deal. It's a part of the deal. And sadly, I think a lot of people feel cut off from it because of what their teachers might have said, or having to study proof rock in college, and getting tested on it. And no offense to T.S. Eliot, that's a hell of a poem, right? But when I was studying it at the University of Michigan, I didn't love it. I hated it. And so why is that? Why is poetry taught this way? As if it's somehow kind of a code that you crack. I just don't buy it, even when it's difficult. And so I say, read poetry without somebody over your shoulder telling you, what it supposedly means. Work it out yourself, and I think you get a lot more out of it. That's my manifesto.
It's a good one. So let me ask you this. Have you ever read The Beginning of Spring all the way through by Penelope Fitzgerald?
The Beginning of Spring is one of the great novels of my recent life. And yes, I have read it all the way through, even though the first time I read it a couple of years ago, 3, 4 years ago now, I, I knew how important the book was going to be to me, so that I slowed down, and finally I was like, well, I have 18 pages left. I'm going to finish this. So I started it over because I just wanted to postpone knowing. And we could geek out on Penelope Fitzgerald for forever, couldn't we?
Mm-hmm. So we learned a lot about a lot of different spaces that you inhabit as a writer and a reader. So your office is one. Can you talk about your office a little bit, because we really do get a little bit of an inside look at your office.
Well, I have a little like a studio space in an old railroad hotel in White River Junction, Vermont. And a lot of this book was written during, the pandemic, obviously, which still goes on. But it was written, some of it at least was written at the height of the pandemic, when we were when we were on lockdown, obviously. And, there was some mandate, at least in Vermont, that only essential workers could be moving around. And I was not an essential worker, but I also didn't want to stay home. I need to be away from home to work often. And so I'd go into the hotel where I was completely alone. in this old rambling, shining like hotel, and I'd just be sitting there, the only person, and it was weird, and it was quiet and lonely, and I loved it, and I think if there's any like kind of for whatever interest it might be, like this book comes out of that sensibility, like this the kind of like feeling um kind of alone in a big old hotel.
I love that idea. And I want to ask you one more thing about. I want to choose something from the night section. So Alan Grossman
Uh-huh.
and weeping.
Yeah.
Can we talk about weeping?
Sure. Sure. uh,
The woman on the bridge over the Chicago River.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, the title of that poem speaks for itself, right? The woman on the bridge over the Chicago River. And it's a poem about weeping, and it starts out everything's weeping. The trees are weeping, the grass is weeping, the wind is weeping, the sun is weeping. I don't, everything's weeping. I don't have it in front of me, but the moon is weeping, everything's weeping. Insects are weeping, horses are weeping, and including this incredible line in that poem that really resonated. I mean, I think part of the thing with this and with so many other writer moments in writing we're talking about is that we can't help, and I don't think this is like an ego thing or a or kind of a narcissistic thing or whatever, to turn inward when a piece of literature gets under your skin, right? And there's a moment in that Alan Grossman poem where he says something like, it's a small boy is listening to his parents make love in the next room, and there's like a kind of weeping sound there. And it's, and he says something along the lines of the weeping of his own begetting. And it's just an incredible uh, image, or even just detail, really. And then the poem shifts from all that weeping to another very specific instance of weeping, where the poet is remembering as a young boy seeing a woman standing on a bridge over the Chicago River and crying into the river, and it's just an image that has stuck with him all those years, and it got me thinking about how those people that we have seen weeping in public,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like where everything, any inhibition that you have has gone away, because it takes a lot to weep in public, right?
Yeah.
And so, but we've all seen it. Maybe we've done it, right? And just what does it take to strip away all those inhibitions? It's weird. I was since this book has since I finished it, I was sitting in a hotel in Boston. It was New Year's Eve. I hate New Year's Eve. I like to if like my friends and family at a party, I which they were, I sat in the lobby of the hotel and I was reading. And it was really pretty late at night. It was because just a lot of chaos going on. And this young woman was sitting in a few chairs, on the other couch, and just crying her eyes out. And it was just, it's incredibly intimate, and you don't know what to do. Like, do you comfort, you know? Luckily, the guy behind the desk tried, and that was nice. I was sort of paralyzed. Anyway, the point is, I guess, that I got me thinking about what, what that kind of sorrow means when you just let it go, and where you are doesn't matter. And I think that poem sort of speaks to that. And yeah, I was just thinking about the times in my life when I've seen people do that.
This same chapter has one one of my favorite moments in the book. There are many favorite moments, but this is one of them where you say, I bought this copy of The Woman on the Bridge Over the Chicago River in Iowa City at a store that no longer exists. Not a store, really, just the house of an old man. He'd put books in a milk crate on his front porch. If you found something you liked, you took it. Stuffed a buck or two under the floor mat where there were always other stray dollars he never collected. That's just something so beautiful.
Well, I'm obsessed with
Yes.
this idea of where you buy the book, where you found the book, and I think, I know you feel it. I know you do this too. Like you know where you got that book that you love.
Yeah.
And since we both haunt a lot of used bookstores, it's usually not for me a new bookstore. It's usually I like to read a book someone's read or cast off or forgotten about and sold or dropped off at a used bookstore for free or whatever. And I one of my favorite places in the whole world are used bookstores, and it just breaks my heart when they close.
Yeah.
So please go out to your local used bookstore and buy like 10 books because these people, like, it's a labor of love. Like, why would you run a used bookstore? You think to barely make a living? There's no,
Yeah.
So please. And this book is full of where I bought, this used bookstore and that used bookstore. And I find that they're, the greatest places in the world. And they're not like antique stores, which are all kind of, I don't know, prissy and rarefied, at least some of the, high end antique stores. Used bookstores don't have a lot of attitude.
Well, but that's the truth about this book. So it's very hard to explain to people, or it will be very hard to explain to people.
Tell me.
But no, but then it just it makes sense. I mean, it is about the reading life. It is about the writing life in a way too. I mean, of course, and it is about your family and your mom, and even about your childhood, your brother, your teacher, your this place where you can leave a couple of dollars under the mat and take a book. I mean, it's about so many different things, and they all sort of combine. And so you called it a memoir, which I thought was very interesting. I didn't expect you to call it a memoir. A memoir in essays, but that's what it is. So it's about so many different things of so many different parts of a life.
Yeah, I run away from the word memoir, but then I realize that yes, it's what it is. It just isn't what you normally might think of as one. And I've used this phrase before, and I think maybe I overuse it, but the idea of just sort of a reluctant memoir, at least that's what the last one was. I don't think this one was actually reluctant. It's a acknowledgement that reading and thinking about other people's words are intrinsic to my own existence, as blown up as that sounds. Intrinsic to my own walking around, let's say, like it's just constant. And again, I made this joke before, but I have a friend, my good friend Julie's a yoga teacher, and she always tells me, you don't live in the present. And I say, exactly, right? This is like my whole point is not to live in the present, right? But in a way, the reading that I do, and the reading you do, and the reading maybe somebody listening does, I'm sure, is as much a part of the forward momentum of their life as anything else. And even when that reading sends you back to the past, you know what I mean? I think that's remembering is a forward act. It's not a backwards act. That's if that makes any, I don't know if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me.
That makes total sense.
That's what I like. Remembering is sort of as a verb of action, as opposed to something passive.
That's why you are an essential worker. Thank you, Peter. Peter Orner is the author of the essay collection, Still No Word From You. His previous collection of essays is Am I Alone Here? Notes on Living to Read and Reading to Live. He's also the author of 2 novels and 3 story collections, including Maggie Brown and Others. Peter Orner is the director of creative writing at Dartmouth College. He's the co-host of the Book Public series, The Lonely Voice, with Peter Orner. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. We had help this week from David Martin Davies. I'm Yvette Benavides.